Look at that. That's an iceberg.
It's like the biggest cruise ship is going to hit an iceberg and it's going to sink.
On April 15, 1912, the whole world was thrown into mourning as news of the sinking of the Titanic broke throughout the world. How could a ship that was deemed practically unsinkable be lost to the wicked grip of the Atlantic Ocean?
That is weird.
Nobody could really grasp the scale of the incident. But as we have come to discover, the Titanic sinking was a product of many simple mistakes, which led to its eventual demise. Here are 20 astonishing facts about the Titanic catastrophe that you've never seen before. Number 20. Survival was by class. One fact many people don't know about this disaster is that it was largely influenced by classism. As the events unfolded on that fateful night, it became obvious that surviving the Titanic was not just up to nature. Your social class also played a huge role. It is sad, really, to discover that even in one of the most desperate moments ever recorded in history, survival was still determined by whether you were a first-class passenger or a second-class. This was especially common among women, and it reminds us of the level of moral depravity that has been ingrained in our society since time immemorial. According to statistics gathered by Chuck Anesi, who was one of the most influential people on board the ship, the gap between the survival rate of first-class passengers and those in other lower classes was astonishingly wide. He discovered that 97.22% of the 144 female passengers in the first class were rescued. This meant almost all of them made it out of the ship alive. Compare this with just 14 out of the 168 women in the second class who were lucky to be alive. Even on the men's side, the difference was still well pronounced. According to the statistics, 32.57% of the first-class male passengers survived the incident, and only 20 second-class passengers died. This meant that only 1 in every 5 second-class male passengers made it out of the Titanic alive. This should remind you that catastrophic events have the potential to bring out both the best and the worst in every human. Number 19. The richest man in the world perished with the Titanic. While influence and affluence may have played a huge role in how the sinking of the Titanic played out, it didn't really work for some. Did you know that the richest man in the world at the time was one of the passengers aboard the ill-fated ship? John Jacob Astor, the millionaire businessman who was a member of the prestigious Astor family, was considered the richest man in the world at the time. His net worth was pegged at about $87 million. Doesn't sound like a lot by today's standards, right? Well, that's about $2.64 billion in today's money, so this guy had a pretty huge sum. You would think that the richest man in the world would have been the first to be placed on a lifeboat. But this man's story is pretty strange. Mr. Astor had been traveling the world on honeymoon with his beloved wife, but then his wife got pregnant and Astor wanted the baby to be born in the United States. So they booked a passage on this prestigious ship. But unfortunately, only the wife survived the disaster that ensued. The man was a victim of the strict rule that mandated that women and children be rescued first by the lifeboats. Even though he was the richest man in the world and could possibly buy the Titanic a couple of times, all of these didn't matter. After ensuring that his beloved wife made it on board the lifeboat safely, he succumbed to the pull of the ship and died on the morning of April 15, 1912. If you thought this was the craziest fact on this list, think again. Because we've still got 18 more astonishing facts that you've probably never heard before. Number 18. Titanic received 6 different iceberg warnings. Into the tumultuous waters of the Atlantic, the Titanic soared. It went at blistering speeds, not minding the perils that may lay ahead. But did you know that the crew of the Titanic were informed much earlier about the icebergs that lay ahead? According to reports, by 7:30 p.m., the Titanic had received 5 different iceberg warnings from other ships. Jack Phillips, the Marconi wireless operator, even took down a detailed message, which pinpointed the location of what was described as heavy packs of ice and a great number of icebergs. But Phillips was too busy sending personal messages, and he didn't show the message to any officer. The 6th one came in at around 10:55 p.m., when the Californian radioed the Titanic, informing it that it had to make a full stop because the waters ahead were too treacherous. But despite the many warnings, the crew of the Titanic, led by Captain Edward John Smith, ignored the signs, and the rest, they say, is history. We can't help but wonder how differently things would have turned if they had listened to all the warning signs. Number 17. A Japanese survivor was deemed a coward. Honor is a very integral part of Japanese culture, and there is no better way to prove your honor than in death. This is the backdrop from which the epic tale of Masabumi Hosono unfolds. Hosono was a Japanese bureaucrat who was working in Russia as the vice-chancellor of the Railway Board for the Japanese Ministry of Transportation. The 42-year-old was on his way home, and instead of making the trek across Russia, he decided to board the Titanic in Southampton, England. At least if he was going home, he would go in style. But instead of traveling in the first-class section, he decided to opt for the second class. This was because he was practically the only Japanese traveler on board and didn't want his presence to arouse unnecessary attention in the predominantly white population of the first class. As the events of the evening unfolded and the Titanic headed for its doom, Hosono had already accepted fate and was prepared to die when he was informed that there were 2 spaces available on the lifeboat. But as you would expect, Hosono was a bit hesitant. He knew the consequences of his survival in such a terrible event once he was back home, but reasoning prevailed, and he leapt onto the boat just as another man took the golden opportunity. When Hosono finally got home, you wouldn't believe how cold his reception was. Everyone criticized him, calling him a coward. Now, Japanese culture may be pretty hard to understand for the rest of us, but apparently he had committed the taboo by avoiding an honorable death. For the rest of his life, Hosono was subjected to what the Japanese called mura hachibu, which was a form of social ostracism. He initially lost his job, but he was way too valuable and was subsequently rehired. But things were never the same for him. You see, even though he was back at his old job, the weight of the stigma hung over his head like a dark cloud. He was said to have lived in quiet shame and recluse for the rest of his life until he died in 1939. What a sad story, right? Well, get ready for more shocking facts from the Titanic. This next one will definitely blow your mind. Number 16. The death of Isidor Strauss. Everybody knows the story of Jack and Rose, the fictional characters of the Hollywood version of the Titanic event. But did you know that there is a true love story that will literally put the Jack and Rose story to shame? This is the tale of 2 lovebirds, although they weren't as youthful as the fictional lovers. The story centers around a man named Isidor Strauss. He was a Bavarian-born American businessman and politician, but you might know him better as the co-owner of Macy's department store. On April 14, 1912, as the Titanic neared its end, Isidor and his wife were among the over 1,000 passengers that were left. It wasn't as though this man and his wife couldn't have used their position and affluence to secure a place on the boat, but the story takes quite a unique turn. You see, when Isidor was offered a spot on the lifeboat, he declined because he didn't want to receive preferential treatment, while there were still women and children on board. His wife Ida also refused to leave his side, claiming that if Isidor didn't go with the boat, she wouldn't either. It was a love story straight out of a romance novel. In Ida's own words, "I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived, so will we die together." With those words, she surrendered her seat on the lifeboat to her maid. Their love story remains forever etched in those cold waters and in the hearts of everyone who was present that day. Number 15. The book that predicted the Titanic. The sinking of the Titanic is regarded as the most infamous disaster of the 20th century. Everybody has heard of it. But how many people know that this disaster was almost accurately predicted in a book that was written 14 years before the event? You've probably never heard of the book Futility, The Wreck of the Titan, written by Morgan Robertson, a revered United States writer. This eerie story tells of the doom that befell the world's largest passenger ship. According to the story, this massive ocean liner had sunk into the ocean after hitting an iceberg. Sounds familiar? Well, that's pretty much the story of the Titanic. Was this book a prophecy that no one took seriously? Or was this just an unlucky coincidence? While reason may tend toward the latter as a better explanation, it's pretty intriguing to consider the possibility of such a book containing an actual premonition for the Titanic event. Number 14. The ship that watched the Titanic sink. The sinking of the Titanic gave birth to many heroes and few villains. One of the main characters in this story, which ranks pretty high on the list of villains, is the SS Californian, the ship that watched the Titanic sink. Remember earlier when we talked about how the Titanic was warned many times about the terrible waters that lay ahead? Well, the crew of the SS Californian gave some of the loudest warnings. As a matter of fact, the ship itself had to rest for the night, as the path was too treacherous for them to continue. The man at the helm of the affairs of SS Californian was Captain Stanley Lord, and that night he made a terrible decision that led to the avoidable death of thousands. Did you know that the SS Californian was located pretty close to where the Titanic was? But by the time the crew of the Titanic sent distress signals, Captain Lord and his men had called it a night. Wireless communications were switched off, and the distress rockets were ignored. In an alternate universe where the SS Californian races to the rescue of the Titanic, things would have taken a different turn. Many people even believe that all the passengers on the Titanic would have been saved if the SS Californian had sprung into action after clearly seeing that the Titanic was in trouble. Number 13. RMS Carpathia launched a life-saving rescue operation. Most accounts of the Titanic often end with the sinking. But after the survivors made it onto lifeboats, how were they able to get off the waters? While the SS Californian minded its business and its men enjoyed a good slumber, the men and women aboard the Titanic fought for their lives. Fortunately, another ship that was around the neighborhood quickly sprang into action, ultimately saving the lives of hundreds of people. On Thursday, April 11, 1912, the RMS Carpathia sailed from New York, headed for Trieste. Little did the crew know this was their ride to fame. At about 12:15 a.m. on the morning of April 15, 1912, the wireless operator of the Carpathia, Harold Cottam, was getting ready for bed when the distress call of the Titanic came in. In a matter of seconds, the entire ship was awake with activities. Everyone scrambled to their positions as they set sail to rescue as many people as they could. At about 4 a.m., the Carpathia reached the Titanic's crash site and instantly began to take in survivors from the lifeboats. When the ship eventually arrived in New York on April 18, it was met by a horde of reporters and spectators who had gathered to welcome the lucky few who had gone to hell and back. If the RMS Carpathia had not come to the survivors' aid, there would have been no single survivor from the incident. Number 12. Life-saving drills that were ignored. The Titanic disaster was a perfect symphony of unrelated events that ultimately culminated in the sinking of the ship. One of such little things that ultimately led to this big disaster was the fact that the crew hadn't been trained to handle such a disaster, or any disaster for that matter. By standard, a ship that massive was required to carry out a lifeboat drill, training the crew on what to do whenever they ran into trouble and had to abandon ship. On the morning of the collision, a lifeboat drill was scheduled to be held, to train the crew on how many people a lifeboat could safely carry, as well as other important information that could have saved a lot more people. But it was a Sunday morning, and Captain Smith wanted to host a religious service instead, as this was his last trip before retirement. This simple exercise that was completely ignored eventually led to many errors during the evacuation process. By the time the chaos had erupted, the officers didn't know how many people they could evacuate on one lifeboat. Because of this, some of these lifeboats left the scene with only half their capacity. You should now understand why the Titanic is considered a disaster born out of negligence and several little mistakes. Number 11. The epic tale of Violet Jessup. The story of Violet Jessup, known as the Unsinkable Lady, is one of the most fascinating tales from the Titanic disaster. Born in 1887, Violet was a stewardess and a nurse who was one of the survivors of the disaster. But there's a tiny little detail in her story that sets her apart from other survivors of the incident. For most people, surviving a massive disaster like the Titanic was enough for one lifetime. But Violet's story was anything but ordinary. 4 years later, she was also aboard the World War I hospital ship Britannic when it sank. Amazingly, she also survived. But that's not all. This lucky woman was also aboard the RMS Olympic when it collided with Hawke on September 20, 1911. This earned her the nickname, the Unsinkable Lady. Whether by luck or crazy coincidence, the story of Violet Jessup remains a mystery, even after many years. Number 10. Titanic was one of the first ocean liner with a swimming pool. If only the Titanic hadn't met its unfortunate fate, it could have been one of the most luxurious vessels available. This was the exact vision for its construction. From its head to its toes, the Titanic was brimming with luxury. It was considered the ultimate millionaire experience. The captain himself was known as the Millionaire Captain, as he had acquaintances with some of the richest people at the time and was often responsible for their commute. The Titanic also had the first of many things, including being one of the first ocean liners to feature a swimming pool. Check out this beautiful pool, which happens to be the only swimming pool on the ship. It was located on the starboard side of F deck and featured a whole lot of restrictions. This shouldn't come as a surprise, since racial, gender, and class segregation was the order of the day at the time. While the men were allowed to swim for free at some point during the day, women didn't have such luxury. They had to pay every single time they went for a swim, and were also restricted to some specific times during the day. Legend has it that the Titanic pool is still filled with water to this day. Number 9. The man who survived by getting drunk. Many people don't know the story of Charles Juin, the chief baker of the RMS Titanic, who survived the incident by getting as drunk as he could. The story is pretty crazy, so we'll break it down for you. You see, immediately he heard the collision, Juin rushed out of the bunk and headed to his workspace. There, he ordered his staff to begin stocking the lifeboats with bread and biscuits. After this was done, he headed straight for his cabin for a little drink, before he headed topside to help load the lifeboats with people. Although he was offered a space on the boats, he vehemently refused, and even began forcibly putting some women in seats when they hesitated. By 1:30 a.m., most of the lifeboats were already filled. While for many people, this was a sign that there was absolutely no chance of survival, Juin took this as a sign to head over to his cabin for another drink. With liquid courage, he eventually became one of the last people to enter the water as the Titanic disappeared into the waters. Thanks to the biological effects of alcohol on the system, which helps reduce the effects of the ice-cold water on his body, the chief baker was eventually pulled out of the water after swimming around for 2 hours. The only issue with this story is that Juin was too inebriated to accurately remember the details of this incident. Number 8. Titanic's youngest survivor. Meet Milvina Dean, the 9-week-old baby who was the youngest survivor aboard the doomed Titanic. On April 10, 1912, Dee boarded the Titanic along with her mother, Georgette, Bertram Frank, her father, and her brother, Bertram Vere. But did you know that the family wasn't even supposed to be on the Titanic? According to historical accounts, their trip was originally planned with another White Star Line ship in mind, but a coal strike led to the cancellation of their original voyage, and they had to alter their plans. As the events of the night unfolded, Dean, her mother, and brother were fortunate enough to make it out of the wreckage alive. Unfortunately, the father didn't make it, as he was part of the third-class men who weren't even allowed on the lifeboats. By the time the Deans returned to England aboard the Adriatic, her story had made her and her family quite famous. People lined up to hold the cute baby. It was so bad that the officer had to make a rule that a person could only hold her for 10 minutes. Number 7. British newspapers lied about casualties. On Tuesday, April 16, 1912, the day after the Titanic's sinking, the Daily Mail reported a big fat lie to the British people. It read, "She sank at 2:20 in the afternoon. No lives were lost." This gave false hopes to many families who had been hopeful that their loved ones hadn't met their end in the disaster. You see, this wasn't the days of advanced telecommunications, when you can just pick up your phone and call to check if they're okay. News came in after many days, and even at that, you never really know what to believe. The Daily Mail newspaper even reported that all the passengers were taken off, even though they had no idea how the ship and its occupants were doing. But by Wednesday, new information had come in, and it wasn't good at all. A new headline was written, inspiring wailings and mourning in several homes. It read, "Boatloads of women, few men among survivors. 868 saved, 1,490 missing." This reminds us of how the reporters and journalists at the time worked hard to bring the public up to date with the story, easing the suspense of many and helping many families hold on to hope that their loved ones were not part of the casualties. Number 6. Titanic orphans. The story of the Titanic sinking is intertwined with a family drama involving a man known as Michel Navratil Sr., his 2 children, Michel and Edmund, and his wife, Marcel. The couple were in the midst of their divorce at the time, and Navratil Sr. had received permission from his wife to take the children with him during Easter break. But the man had other plans in mind. He quickly seized the opportunity to abduct the children and set sail for America to start a new life. Unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be. By the time the Titanic was underwater, the father was dead and the 2 sons were dubbed the Titanic orphans. This was because they had traveled under false names Louis and Lola, and they also spoke no English, so tracking down their family was pretty much impossible. Fortune, however, smiled on these boys, and they were taken in by another survivor, by the name of Margaret Hayes, who lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Fortunately, their mother was able to identify them in a newspaper story, and they were eventually reunited. Before we go on with the rest of the video, here's our subscribers' pick for today. On the day the Titanic sank, the waters of the Atlantic Ocean got unexpected visitors. Unfortunately, these cool, calm waters became the graves of many lost souls who had boarded the vessel on the way to an adventure of a lifetime. While many bodies were recovered from the ocean, identified and promptly buried, so many remain lost to the grips of the waters. Even after several years and several expeditions, the location of many people who died in the incident remain unknown. Share your thoughts on this with us in the comments section. Now, let's get back to the video. Number 5. Treasures of the Titanic. As the mighty Titanic sank to the bottom of the ocean, human life was not the only invaluable treasure that was lost within the vessel. From ancient artifacts to expensive teapots, here are a couple of treasures that went down with the RMS Titanic. There's the gold necklace made out of a megalodon shark attached, now lost at the bottom of the ocean. Although we don't really know who the necklace belonged to, the level of high caliber who were aboard the ship makes this less surprising. There were also 5 Steinway's pianos being transported on the Titanic. After the Titanic sank, the piano keys, hammers, and hinged components were left suspended due to the wood's buoyancy. These pianos are known to be some of the priciest on the market and have been so for over 170 years. This should give you an estimate of their worth. But the item that has often been regarded as the most expensive on the ocean liner was the 1814 painting La Circassienne Aubaine. The remarkable art was painted by French artist Marie-Joseph Blondel. This depiction of a young naked woman, who was pictured bathing in a setting from classical antiquity, was valued at about $100,000 at the time. That's about $3 million in today's money. Although the human loss far outweighs the financial losses, the several treasures that were lost to the disaster also hold their own special place in history. Number 4. Animals of the Titanic. Accompanying the thousands of humans on their doomed journey were many pets, including dogs, cats, chickens, birds, and of course an unknown number of rats. However, we aren't so sure if the rats were pets or pests. About 12 dogs were said to have been brought aboard the Titanic, but only 3 of them made it out of the tragedy alive. Some of these dogs were said to have belonged to the first-class customers who were allowed to keep their pets with them, instead of shipping them off to the kennels of the ship's F deck, where the rest of the dogs were kept. The man responsible for taking care of these canine companions was John Hutchinson. Thankfully, some of the dogs were able to escape with their humans, This included Margaret Hayes' Pomeranian, which got away safely in Lifeboat 7 and lived until 1917. Then there's also the Pekingese owned by Henry and Myra Harper, who also escaped the incident on Lifeboat 6. But unfortunately, some of them didn't make it. There is even the depressing story of Helen Bishop's dog, Frou Frou. As Bishop scrambled to escape to safety, she had to abandon her precious canine friend. The dog even tried to keep her from leaving by biting into her dress until it tore. Unfortunately, a higher percentage of the animals perished in the disaster. Number 3. Titanic Binoculars. For many years, people have argued that the sinking of the Titanic was an avoidable tragedy. Of the many mistakes that were made aboard that ship on this fateful day, the absence of the life-saving binoculars. With these binoculars, the iceberg would have been spotted before it was too late. So, what exactly happened to this critical equipment? Well, it wasn't as though the binoculars were not on the ship. That issue was with the key that opened the box where it was housed. The man who held the key was a sailor by the name of David Blair. Unfortunately, he was reassigned to another ship at the last minute and couldn't make it onto the ocean liner. Could the outcome have been different if the crucial equipment hadn't laid useless in the crow's nest? Is there even the slightest possibility that the iceberg would have been spotted from afar and the ship would have avoided the collision? While we can't really tell if things would have played out differently, it is interesting to explore the possibility. Number 2. Titanic's unknown child. At the time of the Titanic sinking, the death toll was pegged at about 1,497. While many bodies were recovered, the names remained elusive. One of the most enigmatic stories of unidentified victims was that of a 19-month-old baby. 5 days after the ship sank, the crew of a rescue ship, Mackay Bennett, sighted the body of a fair-haired boy, who was roughly 2 years old, floating on the water. Because the identity of the boy was a mystery, he was buried in a cemetery in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Only recently was the boy identified as Lilise Goodwin from England. The family was said to have been traveling third class on the ship, which must have also contributed to their eventual death. On August 6, 2008, relatives of the Goodwin family held a memorial service in Fairview Lawn Cemetery, where the boy was said to have been buried. You could sense the pain in the air as the world paid respect to the innocent children who unfortunately lost their lives in the tragic incident. Number 1. Titanic wreckage is slowly disappearing. How sad would it be for the world to lose the Titanic twice? Did you know that scientists estimate that the wreckage of the Titanic will most likely disappear around 2030? Why? Well, the ship has been sitting at the bottom of the ocean for over 100 years now, and that's more than enough time for nature to take its toll on the wreckage. It initially sat undisturbed for 70 years, until it was discovered by the United States Navy on September 1, 1985. Since then, several manned and unmanned expeditions have been sent to the site to explore the ghostly remains. Unfortunately, we may not have that luxury in the next couple of years. This is because microscopic bacteria are currently eating at the metal, and by 2030 the remains will have been reduced to a pile of rubble. So, while it is still here, we hope to learn of its secrets as much as possible, because one day it will vanish forever. The next generation will have to depend on the stories we pass down to them about this catastrophic event that has continued to shake the world after so many years. Thank you for watching this video. See you in the next one.